So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and we're going to do an actual Session 0 for an as yet unnamed campaign. So if you want to follow along, there will be a link to the questions that Jeff is going to use in the description. And so you can actually read the questions and then how we butcher them and take them far, far off topic. So it's important to know going into this So one important caveat we want to mention is that this Session 0 is going to be really usable to watch, and it's going to be very real. It was important to us that we really didn't talk about any of it beforehand because we want to emulate how these things really go and how sloppy and sort of ugly they can be, but how at the end it's really worth it. But the one caveat is that we're going to be playing in a campaign setting called Dragon Grin. It's a campaign setting that we actually are writing a book for. We've all worked on this book extensively for months. So we're going to have a lot of information on hand that you, if you were doing a Session 0, would probably be asking questions about. Don't think you have to know a campaign world super well to jump in and do a session in it, because this is just an opportunity we thought to play in a world we love. So we wanted to make that disclaimer up front. Don't think, oh my God, I could never do that. These guys know everything about every world. No, it's not that. So disclaimer aside, I'm going to throw it over to Jeff because he's going to be the dungeon master. James and I don't know very much about what's going on. So here we go. Real Session 0. We all showed up at Jeff's house.
So we'll just go ahead and get through it. So I have a list of questions here that we'll be reading from. Just going through, making a note that I kind of put together beforehand, and writing down what everybody says. Whatever the easiest way for you to do that is fine. I like to use just Google Docs and things like that, but everyone has their own methods. So the first question that we will probably kind of lightly skip over is if people are going to be showing up at the Session 0 who have never played a tabletop game before at all, taking a little bit of time to even explain what to expect, how the game works and things like that, is kind of its whole own process, which can be very important to kind of get people on the right track early on with that. But we are all experienced with tabletop games, so we don't need to do that specifically for this. But then getting into the questions specifically about the campaign that we're going to be playing. So the first question is, what setting is the game being played in? What are the pillars of the world? So the setting, of course, being, the world that the game takes place in. So is it in Star Wars? Is it in Middle-earth? Is it in Dragon Grin? Is it in Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or my homebrew world of whatever? There's a million different things that you can kind of set games in. So just being clear about where that's going to be and what comes along with that world and what it means to play in that world is a sort of great starting point. So for us, we're going to be using our own setting of Dragon Grid. So I guess what since we all know Dragon Grin, I'll kind of see where you guys are sitting first. Of when you think Dragon Grin, what are some of the pillars about Dragon Grin that come to mind? It's like, oh, when I think of this setting, it's this. It's basically the pillars are what makes this setting feel different than other settings. So like, for Star Wars, it might be that there's something called the Force that, flows through everything and you can manipulate it to do like almost magical effects. And there are these orders of mystics basically who use that Force along with lightsabers to do things like that. But then there's also a different pillar might be the scum and villainy, that you have bounty hunters and smugglers who do these illegal and illicit things on the outer rims, basically kind of the highlight parts of the world. So for us specifically, Dragon Grin, kind of what stands out to you is like, this is what this world is about.
Yeah, and I think a good way to look at it is that, and we even called it this in the book, I think, in many cases, where what do you need to know to survive is kind of like a good way to figure out, well, you could easily have a dozen things that you want to share. But the more you share, the more you could potentially wash over people and it becomes to get oversaturated. and they don't know what to focus on. So I think to start, if I had to just throw out a kind of a number, I would say 3 is a really good starting point for a session 0, because then it makes you distill it down to the most important things. The other things you can reveal and play just like any good story. So what do the players absolutely need to know to survive? In Dragon Grin, I would say one of the big ones is that evil has won. So the bad guys are in charge. That's huge. That's a really big, exceptionally important thing that sets the tone of the game. So the other 2 that I would hit on real quickly is that the evidence of these huge titans and these big primordials, they fought in this war eons ago, and evidence of those wars is all over the landscape. So these like titan relics that are like little pieces of like magitech, and like primordial corpses that you can like carve up their bones and make weapons. That's really important because it's all over it. It litters the whole world. So you're not going to go far without probably running into some of that stuff. And then the final thing I would say is that there's this magical maelstrom, this arcane storm of magic called the Bleak that is just festering all over the world. And it's very dangerous, but also very powerful if you can learn how to wield it properly. So you guys have worked on Dragon Grin long enough. Would you say that those are probably like the top 3? Would you guys choose a different one than I did?
I'd probably add an elaboration to the first point, is that evil has won, and that it's basically kind of set up this sprawling totalitarian regime. So you have sorts of, low-level enforcers, which are the marrow and things like that, which kind of, enforce this evil rule upon the people. And we don't need to get too specific down into that stuff right now. But I think that evil has won, but it's not like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Like they've obliterated the world sorts of won. It's like they've kind of instituted a new rule of law, which I think is kind of an important distinction to draw between that point. But everything that you said is right for me.
There is something else that I wanted to touch on, sort of meta-wise, where in this case, Tim, you rattled them off, and like you said, we're all kind of on the same page. That is something that maybe the GM would do if he or she has decided, oh, this is the world we're playing in. But there is also a version of this where everybody talks about what they want the pillars to be. The beauty of this is you're sort of creating a world, but it's so broad that you don't have to get bogged down in details. We could have started with, I'd love to play in somewhere where evil has won. And everybody goes, oh, that's a really good idea, actually. Okay, yeah. So, okay, what else, And that idea where you can very broadly build the very basic outline, and that's just another way to do it if there's not a specific world that you're playing in.
Yeah, that's a great point, that you can kind of reverse the process to kind of make a world for the campaign. Like if you don't even have that set up yet, it can be a great way to start to decide on what that is. So then getting into question 3 on the doc here, what aspects of the world do we want to explore most deeply in this game? So Dragon Grin has a lot of different things. There's lots of different regions. There's lots of different sort of tonal pockets throughout the setting. There's a lot of different things that you could mean when you say, I want to play a campaign in Dragon Grin. So I guess just starting, whichever of you wants to go first.
I'll throw it to you, Jamie.
Which parts of Dragon Grin would most excite you to see come into play?
For me specifically, one of the things I really like about Dragon Grin is that there is a lot of sort of crime syndicates type stuff. Because evil has won, they are very strict about like a lot of the rules and stuff, but there's also a lot of room for corruption. And so it's almost kind of a known, whereas like a really good world to be like, oh, they operate in the shadows. In Dragon Grin, there are a lot of crime syndicates and stuff that are kind of very open. And I love that idea. So anything that kind of touches on that idea that like, no, there's a ton of corruption that's to some degree almost sanctioned in the world. That's something I'm a really big fan of.
Yeah. And I think for me, what I was really interested in is kind of exploring just what does it mean and what are the lines between like it's being a hero will get you killed or like being a good guy will get you killed. Well, what's that line? what does it mean, and who do you have to be good to, and can you actually be doing like a Robin Hood sort of thing where it appears like you're doing bad things, but you're doing them for good reasons. And I don't know, it's kind of a bigger idea, but just the idea of that sort of morality and how something appears versus what it really is. And also, the bigger picture and kind of thinking of like the greater good and things like that. And those are kind of big ideas, but even if we could just kind of play in that space of, it's not always black and white, the good guys and the bad guys in Dragon Grin. And some days the good guys have to do some pretty grisly stuff to stay good. And the bad guys have to do some good stuff to stay bad, and just really playing with that. I don't know if that would be cool with you guys.
Yeah, I dig it. And what's really nice, and again, this is not something we planned at all, is there's a very nice through line between both of their things there of kind of, you have this very formal rule structure, totalitarian, gridlock rule set. But how can you start to play with that? On one end, we have corruption and crime and sorts of abusing that rule set. And then on the other hand, you have, trying to be good within it. So it's just a convenient little way that kind of both of their things kind of tie in. So you can kind of start to notice these bigger themes. And this question, just as a more meta level thing too, can be really important, especially for settings which have a lot of variety. So for example, something like Forgotten Realms, kind of like stock 5e setting of like, you could play a game in Forgotten Realms where you're, in a jungle with dinosaurs, and you can play a game in Forgotten Realms where you're on the Sword Coast in Waterdeep. And like, those games are in the same world, but completely different games. Like those games play out radically differently. So kind of this question is really good at sort of finding those things of like, okay, we're in Forgotten Realms, I'd really like to explore, the sort of who's who of famous Forgotten Realms cities. Like I want to be in Waterdeep, I want to be in Baldur's Gate, and stuff like that. And someone else is like, oh, well, I thought we were doing like red wizards and dinosaurs, so it can, finding out which parts of the worlds that have all these different elements, that can be sort of a great way to start to figure out where in the world to put your focus. So for example, this game, it's already kind of seems just from these first, 2 questions that exploring the life like within this rule set. So we're probably not going to be people like way out on a frontier, where it's just exploration and monster hunting, because then we wouldn't be able to really interact with these formal, like controlled rule sets. So just ideas that are already starting, just kind of illustrate where my brain immediately starts moving. So we'll probably be in a city or some sort of civilized area, something like that. Because that's where we'll be able to interact with the line between being good and surviving, and crime syndicates using corruption to gain from the evil victor, things like that.
And if I could, can I just add something in real quick?
Yeah.
As if you're doing a session 0 and one player does say they want to play with red wizards and dinosaurs, and the other one says that they want to do, like he said, like the tour of the Forgotten Realms, this isn't necessarily the time to figure out how. So you absolutely can just make a list. And that's the answer to the question. It's not, okay, all right, now let's workshop this. How can we make the red wizard? This is just finding out what people are talking about. Because, well, first of all, it'll derail your whole session 0. But how that person is feeling right then in the moment is going to be very different by the time this session 0's over. It's really cool how when people start brainstorming and they start getting on the same page, that they can easily just jump on the train of like, oh man, I was so jazzed about like red wizards and dinosaurs, but like all this stuff you're talking about going to like Baldur's Gate and the history, and I want to make a cleric who is a historian, and before you know it, that has already resolved itself. So this is an exploratory session. These answers are just gathering. It's not the final answer. It's just getting all the pieces, and then as a game master, you can revisit that and try to piece something together that would make everybody happy.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to necessarily hash out all the compromises and differences of opinion right now. It can sometimes just be good to aggregate everybody's opinions, and then like, okay, now that we have everything laid out, we can sort of moving into the actual game session 1 and start to play. You can start to find ways to compromise and make sure everybody gets what they want. All right, so the next question then, question 4, is what questions or mysteries about the setting or the game do we eventually want to see answers to? So is there anything in Dragon Grin where it's like, there's these sorts of, I would really love to see, what happened to the Titans? Or, it would really be cool to see the story of the Dismembered Lord and how he came to power. Like, just things about the world that are kind of like intriguing to you that you would like to sort of see hashed out in the game and maybe either find answers to or just interesting, thought-provoking experiences with, things like that.
So I feel like, Tim, if you're thinking while you think, I want to throw out that, again, this is something that will be very different for people that aren't extremely so familiar with the world. If I were just a fan of Dragon Grin, I would probably say, oh, I don't know where the Dismembered Lord came from. Whereas the three of us have you sort of talked about that and gone over stuff like that at length. So I actually feel like it's going to be a little difficult, but it'll be a cool exercise for, well, how do we land on that answer,
Yeah, and you can keep the questions. If it's a setting that you're not super familiar with, you can start at a very broad, high concept level of just like, what is magic like in this setting? Like if it's a setting that you haven't explored, you can just ask that as the question and just kind of start to, provoke thought of like, oh, well, how is magic going to be different in this setting, compared to how it is in normal settings? Like it could just be questions like, what does it mean to have magic items in this world as opposed to Forgotten Realms? Or it can be very specific to the world of like, what caused the Titans to die in Dragon Grin's history? Like both of those are valid questions and mysteries. You don't have to be too specific or about how you ask these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point too, is that you could get to this question and also say, I'm not sure. Can we circle back a few more questions? Because that is also something where you might feel like you're committing to something, but you're not. You're just like, yeah, let's... So it's funny because I didn't have one at all. And then I was trying to think of like, well, what would I say? And then I started thinking of theoretical questions. And then I thought, so this is an example. If you've never played in a setting, you could say something like, well, who's the most powerful villain? Or... who has the most money? You can just kind of ask these big questions, and that helps the game master now say, oh, cool, that's actually a really interesting question. They probably don't have that answer either, but now it's a little bit of a focus. So I had this question that we purposefully don't answer in the book, which is, I would like to find out who the most powerful living hero is in Dragon Grin, and what are they doing, and why aren't they famous, or why are they hiding? Are they so like, were they in Lightfall, this battle where the good guys actually lost 20 years ago? Like who's the most powerful hero, not just person or creature, but like person who would call themselves a good, benevolent, and then like, what are they doing? Are they out in the open? If so, how? That kind of thing.
And then another thing, because thinking of a question I would want answered, again, knowing so much, it's a little more difficult, but I feel like it works because even if this is something we cover in the book, so my question is something like, I like playing with what the bleak, that arcane maelstrom that's kind of destroying all of this stuff and sometimes raging over areas and causing portals to another plane to appear and things to pour through, what sort of effects that is having. So that's a question where I'm like, I know the effects that it can have, but I like the idea of exploring, an area that has been ravaged by it, or some unique effect that it's had, something that's maybe not even necessarily in the book. So something like that would be mine. Like I like kind of messing with the bleak and seeing what can that do. Maybe it has good consequences. Maybe it has bad, something like that.
Yeah. And just to kind of touch on that, these don't necessarily have to be questions that are not answered. They can just be kind of like areas that you want to explore. So, for example, you could ask the question like, what does it mean to be a cleric in Dragongren? That could be your question that you want to see answered. Now, the book will say explicitly like, well, a cleric in this world is this, and you get these powers from these gods. But that doesn't necessarily tell you like what it's like to be a cleric, like as a person in the world. Like it can tell you how it fits in mechanically and into the lore and these bigger picture stuff. But that's different than exploring what it's like to actually do those things. So yeah, the questions don't necessarily have to be unanswered lore or things like that. It could just be like, what is it, what is it actually like to see these things happen on screen? That can be enough. Alrighty. So that's kind of the big picture setting stuff. So that's already a lot of good stuff to work with. Lots of stuff about like heroes and kind of seeing the effects of the law, good and bad, with a little bit of now like arcane mystery. So that'll kind of be a nice little flavor to add into this like otherwise very grounded story. Now we have questions about the bleak and how those things can matter. So just kind of illustrate kind of how the story is starting to form potentially in my head from this. So the next question 5. These next couple questions are specifically about like this campaign. So the first couple were about the world. Now we're kind of dialing in a little bit more as to what this campaign specifically is going to be. So the first question, but in that section, question 5, is what is the overall pitch of this game's story? So typically that'll probably be something the Dungeon Master kind of has prepared and kind of pitches to the group, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Anybody can kind of offer it. If you don't know, you can discuss it as a group and kind of decide. But just kind of as an example, my pitch that I made that I think I told Tim, but I don't think I've told James, if I remember correctly, is basically there's an area in Dragongren called the Dustmouth, which is the sort of like artisan guild style like contract area where you have all these people who like have different crafts and different skills that they've honed, and they're outside of Grin, which is like the capital, home of the Dismembered Lord, the evil's home base, basically. And these people aren't allowed to live in the main city, but they basically migrate on contract basis to the city to do these different artisan jobs for the people there, and then they go back to the Dustmouth where they live until they can get another job. So I kind of had this idea that you guys would, in the past, for whatever reason, you don't have to have been in a specifically like a skilled worker. You could have any other backstory that comes to mind. But basically, you guys are in the Dustmouth, and things have started to go poorly. Maybe you used to get a lot of contracts, you used to get a lot of work. Now work's not so great, or you were in a good situation, and now things have started to sour. For whatever reason, life in the Dustmouth has kind of been on the back burner lately. Not on the back burner. It's been on the downswing lately. And basically, things kind of come to a head, either off screen or perhaps even in session 1 we do it, where you're blamed for something that you didn't do, or maybe that you did do. We can talk about that. And basically, you're going to be exiled to this place that's called the Red Marches, which is basically like you'll die. Like you're going to die if you go there. But somebody offers to smuggle you out. Like a rebel faction who's infiltrated into Grin basically says like, hey, we know you're going to get exiled. We don't want you to die, but you will die if you go. Let us take you out. We're already going to be leaving. Like we can get you out safe. If you help us in our rebel efforts, basically, we'll get you out. We'll smuggle you out, but as long as you help us in return. But then maybe something goes wrong and you're separated from them and you have to survive on your own, or maybe we just explore that through. But that's kind of like the basic starting point that I had in my mind. Now, any of that's up for conversation. If something didn't hit you quite right there, you want to add something or suggest a change, anything like that, totally cool. But that's kind of baseline. You're in the Dustmouth. Things are bad, about to get much worse when you get this condemnation to be exiled. And then you get this offer, we'll bail you out if you help us. We're rebels, so that's going to be trouble, but it's better than being dead, as kind of a starting ground. So what are you just kind of general, for one, is that something you guys are even interested in? If not, we can totally scrap that. That's totally okay. Is there anything you'd like to see changed or elaborated on? Anything like that? Just general thoughts.
I was really hoping for Red Wizards and the Dinosaurs, if I'm being honest. No,
I wanted to do an around the world of Forgotten Realms, but in Dragon Grin.
No, but seriously, I really love that idea. And coming into this, I had, a very rough idea of a character I wanted. And I think that's kind of a better way to do it. And I say that because now I'm like hearing that I'm getting a much clearer idea of what I would like to be. So I really love that idea. And depending on how deep we want to get here, I love the idea of having been a very shrewd businessman, like on top of the world, and then like making the wrong deal or getting swindled or maybe swindling someone. And that's what caused my exile, like kind of almost feeling invincible. And then the next day I'm like, nope, you're kicked out. And then kind of trying to, as a realist to some degree, outside of that structure of grin and like constant stuff happening, trying to make my way in the world while walking that line of morality and seeing where it leads with the crime stuff.
Yeah. And I think so, and just being real, like if you have, let's say you had an idea, talking to the viewer here, if you have an idea and then James just says that and you're like, wow, that was really similar to the idea that I had, talk it out and talk it through. So I really didn't have any kind of idea, but what he said gave me sort of an idea. And I guess what I'm saying is it's okay if they're a little samey because you're playing in the same type of game. So you look at like a film, it's like, yeah, a heist is made up of criminals. Like that's okay. It's not like, well, you got your lawyer here, your stylist here. So in this case, I feel like I would like to play someone who, if James's character made like a bad deal or was like on top of the world, I want to play the equivalent of a doctor, not literally, but this in our real world translated, a doctor or a lawyer who was either disbarred or lost their practicing license. So like I was great. And then I did something, poor choice, whatever, where I'm now not allowed to technically practice anymore or something where the thing that made you great, the thing that people came to you for in the dust mouth, this craft, you're not allowed. And so now it's kind of reconciling your identity of like, well, who am I if I can't do the thing? And do I do it anyway? And
exactly. And I will eventually get to the point where we talk about why we know each other and everything, but already those ideas are forming where I'm like, well, we probably would have known each other. You know what I mean? Like I see myself being like Wall Street guy, not necessarily in like the markets trading, but that sort of like I said, nothing can stop me. You know what I mean? Liquid lunch, martinis at 3, whatever. Like just like,
yeah,
like absolutely very well paid, nice car, doesn't care about anything. And then my life changes. And I especially like the idea that to some degree, whatever your occupation was at odds with me. Not that we don't like each other, but like you're the guy that makes my job hard. If you're the lawyer, I'm the guy that's like, I'm the prosecutor. You know what I mean? Like the other, something like that, where it's a little bit butt headsy kind of thing. That's not a phrase.
Dude, that's amazing. That's fantastic.
Yeah. We're butt heads.
You're a butthead.
So that's kind of a really good starting point then. So we'll kind of lock all that down, and we'll talk specifically more about characters a little bit further down the line. But it's totally fine that we started to dip into that. A lot of these can start to kind of bleed together as people kind of get excited about certain parts of things and just want to talk it through. So yeah, we'll do that then. Of you guys are in the dust mouth, both successful careers, both aspiring and ambitious. When suddenly the central part of your identity is taken from you, you're no longer allowed to pursue what you had done and kind of spent your life doing. And then suddenly you have to make this like hair trigger decision of like, do I get exiled? Do I leave with these rebels? Do I go tell somebody about these rebels? Maybe that'll get me off the hook. Would that get me off the hook, or would we all go down together? Yeah. And kind of. And at that point, I probably want to start then, maybe not before you guys fall, but like right as this is happening. So this stuff is maybe not even like already happened. Maybe this will be some of the stuff that starts to happen in session 1. just as a potential idea. Like it might be cool to see this happen, on screen per se, rather than just like as a backstory.
Yeah, and I love the idea that we would kind of know where it needs to lead. You know what I mean? That's an interesting idea in the game. Like, well, it's like the 2 weeks earlier in a movie. You're like, oh, well, we know we're getting exiled. So how does that happen?
That's awesome.
Uh-huh.
I also think that it's really cool. So if you're watching this and you're seeing how much we're leaving undecided, that is absolutely on purpose. It's basically like, we're getting some basic ideas down so that we can all make a really cool decision. And that is okay. It's actually encouraged. Like, it's very easy, and maybe even it's attractive to start nailing all this stuff down now. That is not the point of it. Trust me when I say I've tried that too, and it's usually because we haven't figured out all the details. You're essentially saying, all right, let's just go from here, and if we run out of building materials, who cares? We'll run out of train track. You don't want to do that.
Yeah, for sure. There's going to be plenty left up in the air, but it's the sort of thing of like once you kind of get the direction and the frame sort of built for the project, it's way easy to fill in all those small details of like, okay, but then like, where did you come from? How does you relate to this? That can all be answered down the line or even in the game. But because we know kind of how we want it to feel and where we want it to go broadly, any detail that we add in is going to fill into that direction rather than contradict it. And that's the important part. So question 6 then is going to be, what sort of tone, as a general rule of thumb, knowing that any one session or arc might lead in one direction, what sort of tone do we want this game to have? So I'll start on this one. And my kind of general rule that goes for most of my games that I think is just worth saying is I like the potential for there to be like serious role play and like serious emotion moments, but I'm not going to be super hard of like, you stop making jokes. Like this is performance art that you need to be, taking seriously. Like that's not where I want to go. So generally, like, we take the story and the characters seriously, but with, the caveat that we're all trying to have fun, that people can interject jokes and stuff if they want to, as long as it's not completely outside, breaking, the tone, like, and, the sort of feel of the world, where if you're doing actions in character that are totally outside of, what make any sort of sense is very different to me than like an out of character, just funny joke to interject,
Sure.
and things like that. So that's kind of my starting point.
It's the difference between joking that my character is going to open an orange Julius in Dragon Grin and actually pitching that my character tries to open an orange Julius in Dragon Grin.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I don't know. How do you feel like, because I'm down with that, where it's like, we also have, so if you're playing with people who you've never played with before, there are going to be a variety of different styles, and what they do and how they do it is just, it's an unknown until you play with them. And that's part of why you do this. So something that you can do is choose shared experience or media, because then everyone has a frame of reference. So if I said, hey, in a way, I would like this to almost feel like maybe like a Guy Ritchie movie. I don't mean quite literally, but just that sort of, that vibe of it. It can be really dark and serious and someone is, shot or their hand is cut off. And then in the other scene, it's just hilarious. And there's this weird, quirky character that's a bookmaker. And so like, if I would say maybe like a pinch or a portion of that vibe of like, it's the kind of movie that starts out and one of the characters has the broken nose bandage. Like that kind of thing,
Yeah. Another thing that I think is important to mention here is the idea that if you haven't played with people, this may be my own only anecdotal experience, but it's something that's happened to me a few times. If you're playing with people that you haven't played with, and especially people that haven't played RPGs before, in my opinion, what I've found is it tends to be that the game starts a little more funny, right? Almost like nobody's willing to commit to seriousness and will get more serious over time. So I just want to say that if you're looking for a really serious game, mention that, but just don't try to force it from the beginning, because as you get more comfortable with each other, you can have those really cool moments. But it's never worked for me to go, we need to be serious. It's just not something that you can force on someone. So I just want to bring that up, that we can know, because we've played with each other and stuff, but that it might start out kind of funny at first, but lead into more serious stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of people feel self-conscious and uncomfortable. And the way that they express that is by joking and smiling and laughing a lot, and that don't take that as anything other than them being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but overall,
for sure.
that Guy Ritchie idea is perfect, in my opinion. I love that. And especially because neither of us are like fighter style people necessarily, it seems to kind of fit maybe.
Yeah. So I guess one other note in terms of like tone and game feel stuff is, so I don't require it, in the sense that you can always pull the emergency cable if you're either not comfortable or just don't feel up to it in the moment. But I prefer resolving things with in-character dialogue. Like I enjoy speaking as people. So like if you want to say like my character says something along these lines, like that's okay. I'm totally okay with that. But in general, like having people actually talk to each other in character is something that I really like in a game. So that would probably be the baseline for me. And I'm open to that if that's, putting up red lights for either of you. But that's kind of, at least for me, a starting point of like, if you're talking to somebody, you'll probably be saying actually what you're going to say. And that makes some people uncomfortable. So I want to leave space basically for that. But as a rule, generally, that we want to actually see the dialogue take place in the game rather than just kind of abstractly expressing it. That's kind of my taste.
I like that you brought that up, because it creates an interesting situation for me, because I tend to do both. But when I'm not, I wouldn't say in the mood, but sometimes I'm not comfortable with doing in-character dialogue. And something like that from Jeff in a game would make me go, oh, I'm going to push myself more to be in character, speak in character, because otherwise I've never really had a reason. But it's like, well, it's a little bit outside my comfort zone, but it's something that I know sort of enhances the experience, again, in my opinion as well. So throwing that out, that's just kind of a preference thing, but I think it's good to say things like that so that, again, everybody's just on the same page.
Yeah, and I'm down with that. I think that that's cool. And I think for me, I try to make it so that if it's a moment not worth playing out is usually when I'll say, passage of time, sort of like, yeah, and we kind of go back and forth telling a couple of stories we've told 100 times before, rather than,
No, yeah.
So I'm super down
No,
with you.
that's a great point of like, yeah, I'm not trying to make it super like simulationist and time realistic and things like that. Of like,
Sure.
no, I said you have to wait half an hour, so start the clocks and say something interesting. Like,
Chat it up, baby. No.
so
So
that for small little things of like, and even for things like shopping or something like I'd like to buy a long sword. It's just like, okay, take however many gold pieces off your sheet and have a long sword. Like we don't necessarily need to see every single moment of your characters
Right.
speaking, but if it's plot important or character important, stuff like that is but yeah, that's an important line to draw of like, we're not playing out every single moment across all instances, but the highlights I'd like to see in character. And I guess just again as a meta note of like, this might even be a good time. Like I know both of them and I've played with both of these guys before, so I kind of know generally their play style. But this is also a good time to kind of talk about that of like some groups, really like, story heavy, dialogue heavy, character arcs, stuff like that. Some people just want to like kill monsters and roll dice. And I'm not, casting judgment or making, declarative statements about what's better, what's not. Whatever works for any table is what works for that table. But again, if one person shows up thinking that they'll be Bob the Warrior who can just roll dice and say he kills the goblins, and the other guy's like, oh, but what about the moral quandaries of whether or not that goblin's really evil? And I want to have a dialogue with the party and the goblin about whether or not we can come to some sort of like, both of those are viable options. But if different people are trying to do either one at the same time, it's going to break down pretty quickly. So I kind of already know generally with you guys, we like story, we like character, and some action, some jokes and stuff like that is fun, and we'll have some of that. But, that we're kind of all story gamers in a way, in that sort of way. But, that's not an assumption that every table will have. So talking about that as a group, very important.
Cool. I think this is going really well. I'm excited about kind of what we're building here.
Yeah, it'll be pretty cool. So the next stuff is getting into the fun stuff. These next couple of questions are all about the characters that the players will be playing. So starting off, just most generally, and even if you just kind of have a general picture, a sort of outline, that's okay. You don't have to have a full backstory, fully built character sheet, and everything ready. But just in kind of the broadest sense, the first question: who are the characters that you guys are going to be playing, both mechanically and narratively? So we've kind of already talked narratively of it sounds like both of you are going to have been prior craftspeople or businessmen who, for whatever reason, have been disgraced from their craft. And we can talk about all the very specific details of that now or later. We don't have to do it right now. But there is still kind of a blank space of, this is 5e in Dragongrin, so we will still need a character class and heritage and culture and those sorts of things. So if you guys have any sort of ideas for how you think you'll look in game, any ideas as far as either mechanically what you'd like to play or kind of elaborating more on the story side. But we need both, at least even if it's the barest outline.
And just to interject one thing real quick, I would even say that in my opinion, it's better to not have that stuff, certainly not to have a character created, because if you get to this point, you might be looking at your character sheet and going, oh, this isn't going to work. And you don't want to put in that time with that,
You built the dinosaur hunter for the Red Wizard game, thinking for sure, you know what I mean? And it's like, oh no, now you're a ranger who took tropical forest terrain and you have a dinosaur mount, and it's it doesn't work anymore. So, so I have an idea, and so I think that, so in the world of Dragongrid, now again, this is a campaign setting that we've worked really hard on for a long time, so we know this stuff backward and forward in many cases. So I'm going to give you a general answer, and then I'm going to give you the Dragongrid answer so that people can kind of hear. So a general answer might be something like, well, I really do kind of like fighting, and I don't know, the gamey stuff you talked about. So I don't know, something like that, something where I can roll a lot of dice and feel like I'm powerful and kind of in the thick of combat. That's a fine answer. You don't have to be well, I want to play a fighter with the champion archetype, and then I think I'll go human variant. You might not know all that stuff, and that's fine. So you might go, I don't know. And then who are people who would be kind of scrappy and tough? That's totally cool. And it could just be because then the game master can then offline work with you and have a totally separate conversation about what all those things mean. But you're at least giving the game master that good idea so that it's oh, cool. I see the blob of composition that all these people are playing. So that's the non-Dragongrid answer. I just want to
and real quick, just to add in before you get into the Dragon specific stuff, this helps the game master, but in a big way too, it can help to make sure that the players' ideas for who they want to play aren't going to step on each other's toes. If you don't talk about this and you show up to the game, and it's all right, I've made this awesome paladin, I have this god that I'm devoted to. I'm going to be super awesome with the sword and super strong and have the shining armor. And I'm going to feel like such a hero compared to the rogue and the wizard or whatever. And then you show up and another guy is also the paladin in the shining armor with the sword and the god. And it's just that was supposed to be my thing. I was really excited to kind of, when the spotlight called for the, pious hero, that I would be able to step in and have a cool moment. And now we're going to have to share that. And maybe we can find a way to make that work. But I was kind of really looking forward to that. It can help to sort of avoid that sort of pitfall of I'd like to play a wizard, but if somebody else was really liking to play a wizard, I'd be totally fine playing a cleric instead. Like I'm open. Did you have, oh, well, I had this idea for this divination wizard who used that as a way to use his business model and, for the narrative side of things. And that, I think that could be really cool. It's like, oh, well, you take that, you be the wizard then. I'll be the warlock, or I'll be the cleric instead, just to kind of help shape so that when you get into the game, you don't have to have a perfectly balanced, fighter, rogue, cleric, wizard party every game, but just making sure that people have their own spotlights that they'll be able to have. I think it's really important. So this is a great point to start to draw some of those lines. Sorry, but yeah, Dragon Grid specific stuff. Yeah.
I'm very glad you interjected that, because it's really important to know that it's okay to talk about that stuff. And then even to take that one minor step in, to the left, same paladin, same shiny armor. Someone shows up and they're like a tiefling warlock who worships, some sort of anti version of whatever this paladin. Well, now you have this inter-party conflict where the paladin hates the tiefling warlock, as long as everyone at the table is like, yeah, that sounds fun, but you just don't want it to happen on accident.
Yes.
So yeah. So for the Dragon Grin specific stuff, what I was thinking was, we have these people in the world. They're a culture called the Zarfin, and the Titan stuff we talked about. They sort of work with these pieces of Titan relics that are known as Archons. I don't know how, why, what, but I kind of got this idea of like this shamed Zarfin, who was I'm not sure exactly what class yet, or what. In Dragon Grin, we have a slightly different system. Instead of it being race and subrace, it's heritage and culture. Mechanically, very similar. So I don't know exactly what heritage I would be or what class, but I kind of am thinking like this shamed Zarfin that like is in this like nice Zarfin getup 2 weeks ago, and now it's like the white shirt is all dirty and it's got a couple rips and a little blood stain, and so I don't know. And James, I don't know what you're thinking, or Jeff.
So yeah, I guess some ideas. And again, you don't have to take any of these. As a player, you have agency over your own character. But just something that came to mind that I thought could be kind of cool is the Zarfin are very like insular as a culture. Like they like to work with Zarfin, and they keep their secrets close. Like you only kind of get to learn the art of Archons if you're kind of in the group, and you can kind of prove to them that you're worthy of that knowledge. So in terms of betraying, it could even be something along those lines, like you've given away Zarfin's secrets or something like that, and have kind of been ousted from the sort of guild that you were a collective to, and like not having their protection and their cover. You're now under the direct scrutiny of all the Marrow and the Crucians, who will be wondering why you've been ousted from this group, and like kind of like assume that you've done something ill. You don't have to run with that, but just kind of an idea that popped into my head as far as like a way that we can tie that in to the scenario.
I love that, and I want to illustrate how it's important to go into a campaign by setting up situations and not necessarily resolving them. So I am not going to decide whether I actually did it or whether I'm being falsely accused. So I'm going to take your idea, and I'm purposely leaving that ambiguous as a character. I don't know yet if I want to make it so that I'm on the run and I did it and I feel super guilty, or if the opposite. And I'm not going to tell James or even Jeff that yet, and we'll figure that out in the game, because I think that'll be way more interesting. Did he do it? Did he not do it? And so that's like a little character arc I'm making for myself, and I probably won't decide that until the session that it needs to be decided.
Yep.
Which can be kind of neat. And again, it seems like super scary and like, what are you talking about? You got to know your background. And it's like, yeah, you got to know the basics, but answering the question is why I like to play. So let's do it. Zarfin secrets, totally everything you said, but I'm going to keep it purposely ambiguous in the meta and in game, whether I actually did it or I'm being falsely accused.
And just to cut in with that idea, like you said, not only is that cool, but I think that it can create the coolest situations, because if I knew now, that would color my role play stuff with you later. But if I don't know, it's more like real life in that sense, or it's more real, and it creates more like a movie or show like feel where, well, I don't have that knowledge. I'm not a viewer in this case. I literally don't know if you did it or didn't. And I think that's really cool. So based on everything we've talked about so far with the morality and sort of the crime syndicate stuff, everything that, the pillars we talked about, I like the idea of being a Crucian, somebody that was like in Grin and maybe one of these families, kind of the upper crust of society such that it is now. But I'm sort of thinking I'm like some sort of middleman. Like I imagine I'm like a broker for stuff that the Zarfin create, or just like you said, there's all these guilds. I'm just like a middleman. Like I'm nobody, but I act as though I'm, this big deal, but I'm really not. I'm so replaceable. And I was imagining that something happened, based on what we were talking about for your character, Tim. There was like another Crucian house like set me up or set us up, like my house up. And it's like, I just got caught in the middle. I was just kind of going along, again, not being the best guy, but doing what you do in Dragon Grin. And I like get approached by somebody to, do a deal where something, it's a little under the table or crime syndicate. And it really all turned out to be like a sting operation. And it's like, I got caught in it and that's why I'm getting kicked out. Something like that, where life was going along and somebody saw an opportunity to oust me and they did,
So one of the really cool things about the Grin and the Crucian houses is they basically have this like eternal, it's almost like they play it like a game, but the consequences of it are extremely real in the sense that the houses are constantly kind of vying against each other. So some sort of like political intrigue Crucian sting operation is like totally within, the bounds of what could and undoubtedly would happen like very often in that sort of place of like, I imagine like some sort of like, again, like I'm not trying to tell you what your character is, but just sort of potential ideas is like, the person who actually like takes the contracts to the Dust Mouth to sort of act as a liaison between these like artisan people, and then the Crucians who are too good to deal with those sorts of folk, the super hoity-toity, pretentious level, stuff like that. And then one of the other houses maybe then, played the big Crucian game against you. Maybe not even against you personally, but like, hey, we have a chance to mess up this house and this house, and then your house is like, hey, he's just our middleman guy. It's on him. Like we're washing our hands of this.
Wow.
I really
sort
love
of thing,
that.
and they kind of throw you under the bus. Yeah.
And that seems so Guy Ritchie to me. You know what I mean? That idea. I also like that I absolutely looked down on and was not nice to the people that basically make my job, this, the dust mouth sort of artisans. And I might end up being around and near them. And these are people that know me, like people that I screwed on business deals or underpaid and they can't do anything. And now I might need them to survive. And I'm like, that seems to kind of fit into that morality stuff.
And maybe that's me.
For sure.
Like maybe that's something that, again, I kind of want to leave that a little more open in general, but
yeah,
maybe something you did either forced me to sell Zarfin secrets or made it look like I did, but I think it would be really cool if I was one of the people that you screwed over and now we're stuck together.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so
so just one point to press on really quickly. Did you have even a bare bones estimation of what you would look like in terms of class and or heritage for your character, James?
I'm not remembering the heritage as well as I should be, so that's my fault. As far as class,
that's fine.
Something non like non really fightery. So I was thinking like some sort of variant style of rogue, where in Dragon Grin you would kind of know how to use a dagger, to some degree. I'd know how to pick a lock. I was thinking
especially
bard,
as a Crucian, yeah.
Exactly, where I'm like, that kind of fits. So probably rogue for that reason, but very much like not your normal hide in the shadows style, but like, no, you know how to pick a lock, you know how to, fast talk, that sort of thing.
Could even be like, I think there's like a mastermind archetype rogue or something like that.
Yeah, something like
just
that.
as an idea
Yeah.
to look into. Yeah, but just that the more of the spy master rogue than the cloak dagger assassin sort of rogue. Yeah,
very much so.
Cool. And did we talk about class for your character, Tim? I don't remember
no.
if we mentioned.
Do
you have any at least broadest ideas?
I feel like I didn't have any idea until he kind of mentioned rogue, and I thought it would just be an interesting way to play against, just keeping with this sort of emerging theme that we're opposites. I think it might work if I was some sort of melee or some sort of more hands-on, like, you know, I'm thinking maybe just straight fighter. But then even thinking that maybe there's something of a history there. Maybe I was part of something and I'm kind of trying to start a new life or whatever. So maybe choosing like the battle master or one of the fighters that has like a bunch of maneuvers. So like, yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking something that way so that we would be very yin and yang in combat or situations. And even the way we think would kind of be interesting. Good for buddy cop arguments.
Yeah, I dig it. Kind of start to get into. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that we have a very good idea of like the classes and things in Dragon Grid. I also technically justified why my guy was my class. I just wanted to say you don't have to do that. I could have said I was a warlock, and I'm going to work with Jeff to see who my patron, like, especially if we were starting at level 1, say, I could pick any and we could make it work. I just like justifying.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so that's a very good starting point then for characters. So the next question, question 8, which we've already kind of touched on, so we can kind of breeze through. Will the party know each other at the start of the game? So it sounds like, yes, tangentially, of like, you guys have interacted in the past. You're probably not incredibly close associates or even friends. You're probably enemies to start off with, it sounds like. But not super close and super well tied. Just like, I met him once. It wasn't very fun. I didn't really like it, kind of level of things. So you'll know of each other and have barely interacted, but without any like deep-seated, heavily rooted ties. But if you wanted to make something more concrete of like, no, this deal that we worked on was like this huge landmark thing where we were like intimately working together to pitch this thing that ended up causing this huge problem. Like, I'm open to that as well. But it kind of sounded like it was more brief, and that this is kind of going to be a coming together of like, weren't you that guy that made my life suck, 3 months ago, and now I have to sit here with you, kind of thing. But what do you guys think?
So I'm imagining, it's been a very long time since I've seen it, but there's a movie, I think it's Walking Tall, and it's The Rock and like Sean William Scott, and they don't like each other and they get like handcuffed together. I might be mixing a bunch of different movies together, but I'm imagining that where it's like the same, within that same vein of morality where, just like you said, Jeff, we know each other's names. We worked to avoid each other when we, knew each other. And now we are stuck together. Probably not physically like handcuffed, but that idea where it's like, for some reason, we have to cooperate. And it's really in both of our best interests, but we're really not liking it.
I'm super down with that. And so put in the comments, put the real name of that movie, if you know it before I say it. Very close. You ready? 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, time. It's actually The Rundown.
Oh, that's the one. That makes more sense, actually.
Pretend I'm the Tooth Fairy. Give me my tooth. That's Christopher Walken.
I only remember the trailers. I've seen both of those movies. That is a story for another time, Jeff.
Oh, that is another fighters. All right. So yeah, I think that would be a really cool way where it's like, I think if nothing else, we know of each other. The person being heavily taxed is going to know the tax man. So even if we don't have run-ins, even if we've had probably one or two, like, it's the guy that skipped me in line. We know, I think, and if nothing else, I know what the Crucians are doing. Like, I could definitely stereotype this guy.
Yeah, worst case scenario, even if the interactions are so small and brief that you don't have any knowledge of each other, you still kind of have this dynamic of the working class hating the upper crust and the guy who thinks he's too good, like having to now stoop down to their level. It was just kind of a built-in sort of a personal dynamic that, regardless of any personal interactions, would be easy to pull into the game. Cool. So next question. Question 9 is, what connections, either direct or indirect, do the characters have to each other and to the world? What sorts of secrets and backstories might the characters have? Some of that's already kind of come up as we've just been talking in terms of connections to each other. Probably nothing incredibly concrete, but you've probably worked together before. Probably some sort of contract negotiation that was not fun. Something super basic like that. And connections to the world, we've already kind of established just by nature of kind of the pitch of the game, is that you were, you worked in the dust mouth, that you've kind of built up this life, either, in the trenches in the case of Tim's character, or kind of as that liaison management, level figure in terms of James' character. But is there any other sorts of backstory or secrets or important connections to kind of the world or to the party that we want to talk about? And it's cool if we've already covered enough that you guys are happy.
I don't think I really have anything like that. I do want to sort of meta mention that these things that these questions lead down a specific path. So it is okay to do what we did and cover it before, but make sure if there was, say, one character that didn't really get a lot of spotlight time talking about theirs, that this is where you would definitely cover it. But I think, we have a pretty good idea while still leaving a lot of space where I'm all right with it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there was one thing I did want to possibly explore, which is I know this is related to a connection with the world. I know that the dust mouth is usually work for hire. And in my case, I think it would be interesting if what I'm doing is for my family. It's not like they're not in danger, they're not hurt, they're not dead, but they are off-site, different location. They're not in the dust mouth, and I'm trying to make this money and then send this money home. I think it would be an interesting motive right now if either the 10th is coming due or I need to send money home soon. Some sort of like, as a player and as a game master, I like there to be some sort of a pretty right now conflict or like a very specific short-term goal, because I don't know what my big long-term goals are and I'm not going to try to decide that, but it can be super helpful to not be aimless. We have this plot happening around us, but what am I doing? I think that would be really interesting if like I need to send money home to my family in weeks, not like days, but like I got a couple of weeks to figure this out and get that or something like that.
Yeah, so I really like that a lot too, because if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, your family is not in Grin or the Dust Mouth.
Correct.
So if you guys end up smuggling out of Grin, you could theoretically go find them in the game.
Absolutely.
Later down the line,
yeah,
which is really cool. Yeah, it's a nice point to have sort of hanging in the air to grab at later. One thing that I think would be cool too, specifically for your character, Tim, would be to decide even broadly what sort of area of arcanics you specifically did work for Grin. Were you working on, because I think it's very different if you're, working on war makers and building siege weapons versus if you're, building light, orbs that cast light, and, light the streets. Like, so finding some way to sort of look at the sorts of arcans you were specialized in as a Zarfin, and at least that your Annulus directive was known for. So that way we can kind of just get a vibe as far as, why it's such a big deal to both Grin and the Zarfin that you've done what you've done. So to me, that kind of implies a sort of higher stakes level of arcan, but I'm open to that,
Sure.
And we don't even have to decide now. It's just kind of food for thought, but.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to say. And just as an example, I was going to say that's the kind of thing where, because a lot of the other things are this like kind of flexible thing, that one feels a little more concrete to the character. So, because it says a lot about you if you decide to be a mechanic or if you work on jets, like you're saying, like there are many different levels of mechanic. So, yeah, I'll give that one. I'll write that down on my homework sheet of like, I need to decide this. And I would get back to my game master with plenty of time before the first session.
Cool. All right. So unless there's anything else on connections there, question 10, we've already talked about this one too. So we'll just kind of recap. Where will the party begin the game and what direction will you have, if any? So it kind of sounds like we decided that we want to see this fall and exile and smuggling operation actually happen in the game. We don't want to kind of skip past it into, the aftermath. So I think we'll start the game in the dust mouth, right as whatever's going to happen to sort of kick this event off will be happening. I imagine it's sort of like if you started session 1 like 20 minutes into the Matrix, where Neo is starting to get all these weird phone calls and the agents are looking for him and he's about to have to find out where he's going to go, sort of thing of like it hasn't happened yet, but we're starting like right there, sort of thing.
I'm into that.
Where and then we'll kind of move into in terms of direction. Basically eventually you guys will have some freedom to kind of explore where and how you want to, but it's not, this first session will probably be a little bit more on rails, so to speak, of like something's going to go wrong. You're going to get, sentenced to exile, and you're going to be approached by a rebel faction looking to smuggle you out in return for help on their cause. After that, it'll be very much open in terms of how you guys want to approach kind of like a sandbox plus game, I guess you would say, of like, I'll have plenty of things for you to decide on, but that the specific choices will kind of be in your hands as far as once you've made it out of the gates of Grin, there'll be a lot of freedom that'll suddenly open up. And once we decide on the direction, then we can kind of start to focus back in. But as far as kind of a starting point for the game, that's kind of where we're at. Unless there's, again, comments or revisions that we'd like to make to anything.
No, I mean, that's
Yeah, no, I really like that. And specifically, if you didn't, I was going to say something, as a player that I was happy with even the whole first session being that playing out. Obviously, depending on how the pacing goes, but like that does seem enough that no, I'd be fine with, like you said, a pretty on rails thing to later open up as a player. I think that's a really cool thing.
Yeah. And then, so it's important too that during this process, if you're watching this, there are going to be times where we've all so far have been very agreeable.
Yep.
And so that's great. And it can happen and it does happen. But sometimes there are going to be things you disagree on. And so one of the things that I wanted to state was I agree with everything you said, but I kind of, for me personally, wanted to throw out a caveat. And it's important to know that you don't necessarily have to defend why you don't want to do something. You just have to be constructive and understanding and also listen to why other people do want to do those things and sometimes compromise. So, as Jeff mentioned, he did share with me, at least the original pitch was everything he said, and then he talked about the people smuggling them, me and James, into Sphere, which is another adjacent region. So for me, totally in the meta, and again, that's why I set up that all to say your reasons could be if Jeff was proposing something where they smuggled us onto a pirate ship and you just finished a series on pirates and you're like, listen, I'm a little pirated out. I am kind of like ready for a new thing. That's something where you can say, hey, listen, can we do something other than pirates? So for me, it doesn't seem like this will necessarily be the case because we're playing out the first part and it could go anywhere, Sandbox Plus. My personal preference that I'm laying down now in the meta is I would rather not go to Sphere because that is the place in the actual writing of the book that we spent the most time because it's where we did the first 2 playtests. It's where we did a bunch of different. So for me, I'm kind of sphered out where I'm like, I would love to explore a lot of these other corners of the world that we haven't touched yet. And so,
yeah,
it doesn't have to go this way, but I think that based on everything else we talked about, I'll let you know that in game, my character's probably going to push for Sphere Below because it's very crime. It's like gangs and it just seems like where 2 refugees would go. So that's not a hard line I'm drawing, but I just wanted to throw that stuff out there because we're doing a session 0.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. And I guess just to kind of bring in where my logic had gone to get to that point of just like, there's only one way in and out of Grin, and that's the gate that goes into Sphere. So it kind of would make sense that like you get smuggled out of Grin, you're in Sphere. But we could easily find some justification of like, and then before, because I basically had this idea that like something would happen that would separate you from these rebel people. So you'd either have to find them again or just to find your own life, decide what you're going to do. But we can kind of push that a step back of like, they get you out of the gates, they get you into Sphere, they get you on the caravan that'll go to Sphere below, and that's when you get separated. So we can, the specific region location, it's easy to find that sort of justification. And with what we've talked about as far as, being a hero versus the rules versus crime and crime syndicates, like, yeah, I agree that Sphere below is like a perfect place to explore that. So I think that makes a lot more sense with what we want to do, and we can find a way to get there. Cool. So yeah, that's a pretty good starting point on characters. So these next couple of questions is kind of pulling out, outside of the game world specifically and kind of looking more at meta things. So this category is desires and restrictions. So this is what a way that I commonly see it used is like stoplight of like green light, yellow light, red light of what do we want to be in this game? What do we not want to be in this game? Things like that. So we'll start with question 11. What do you really want to see and get out of this game? What are the things that would make you most excited to play? What types of encounters and interactions would you like to see come up in the game? So we've kind of already talked kind of baseline things like crime and, the line between being a hero and corruption and the rules and things like that. But in terms of like very specific things, and it can even be down to like, I would love a scene where we have to, have dinner with a mob boss where he gives us a job and tells us we have no choice. Like it could be that specific, or just like, I'd like to see, gang wars. I'd like to see business deals, so just what are the things in this game that you really want to see hit on that would make you excited to play in the game? What draws you to the experience? What do you want to be in the game?
So continuing down that, I really, Tim, if you couldn't tell, really kind of latched onto that Guy Ritchie idea, specifically because to me, it does mean so much. Like that context there is like so much where I wouldn't mind combat, but I like the idea that there would be not as much direct combat. I like a lot of, I guess, conflict with intelligent things, right? So a lot less go into the cave and kill all the goblins, and more you can kill them, or, fast talking or dirty fighting, you know what I mean? Getting an advantage, fighting dirty, that idea where it's more human to human stuff, more, again, kind of that Guy Ritchie where it's like, no, I'm going to do my best to screw that guy over or something. And a little bit less, like I said, clearing out monsters sort of thing.
But more about like outsmarting opponents rather than just like killing enemies.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kind of as to try to distill that. But yeah, I'm down with that. Yeah, and I dig that as kind of a general rule of like mindless slaughter is, fine if that's what you want, but that's not necessarily this game. It's going to be more, if you're going to kill somebody, it's going to be with like intent and decision of like, you could have done all these other things, but you decided to bring out the swords. Like,
Exactly. And specifically as a player, that doesn't mean, that's a green light, not necessarily I don't want to fight cave slimes. I'm like, sometimes they're cave slimes, we got to kill them. I get that. But yeah. So specifically that it's just, just a little bit of that will make me happy.
Cool.
Yeah. And I think, just in terms of like everything we've talked about, like, so also too, if you're listening to this and it seems like, wow, this is really deep and intense, and like they're talking about these very specific things that I never would think of, it's fine. We've been playing for years and years and years. And so just like anything else, it's like you get thousands of hours of practice at anything and it's nuanced. So yours could be, I really want to learn how to play the cleric. Like that's a green light for me. I've never played a cleric before and I just don't understand it. And I just kind of want to figure that out. And I'd really love to get it up to like level 7 or 10 would be great. great. We're talking about, like James is saying, some really cool stuff about tone and theme, and you might say, a game with no combat? Like, what? No, that's why I built this thing, or whatever. So your green light could be, hey, I want there, if as much as possible, I'd like there to be kind of a little bit of fun, mindless combat. That could be a totally feasible opposite green light. And I could say that opposite to him, and then we would just have to compromise making that work.
Yeah.
So for me, I love the idea. I'm just thinking of this now because of all that has preceded it. I would kind of like to see us have an opportunity, a real opportunity, to explore how power shifts so quickly and erratically and in like a dangerous, volatile way in Dragon Grin, and maybe give us the opportunity to rise to power, but have equal opportunity to be killed in the process. So if you're in a group of, if there's a gang surrounding you and the leader is there as well as 5 toughs, and James's character outsmarts the guy, kills the leader by cutting his throat, and then I intimidate the toughs into saying, you work for us now, that's interesting to me. Rather than like he's saying, like, fighting we beat the gang. It's more like, no, we became the gang, That could, in my opinion, that could happen in Dragon Grin. And then on the opposite side of that, Amaro sees it and goes, oh, hey, looks like you guys just committed a bunch of murder, so you're working for me now. So that's a very hypothetical specific, but I'm, that it's kind of what I want to explore, is the volatility of power and how your fortunes can change so quickly and you can climb that.
And sort of piggybacking on that, I feel like this sort of thing is important to say to the GM. Again, I feel like we have so much context that I wouldn't have to say this usually, but I am okay with the idea that my character could die at any time because of a poor decision. Again, that's very sort of Guy Ritchie heist movie where, you play 10 sessions and it's all the culmination, and somebody who screwed in session 2 puts a knife in your back and it's over. I'm like, to me, that's a satisfying ending in its own way. And that's the sort of thing that, obviously if a GM did that without any prior, conversation, somebody could feel extremely slighted, but that sort of thing excites me, that I don't have plot armor. And that seems something important to bring up.
Cool. Yeah, I dig that, especially because I'm not an antagonistic GM, but I do like to ratchet up the dials in terms of difficulty. So knowing that I have that leeway to say, like, hey, like, this guy that you didn't finish off, 2 sessions ago, he's back with a vengeance and he's got the drop on you, and he gets that crit and he's laid you down. Like, having permission as the GM to say, like, you're dead, like, he got you, like that, that's not for every game. But, so knowing that that's on the table here is a good thing to know that it's there.
Killer.
Alrighty. And these are the green lights are things that we can sort of start to add to as we go. I'm sure that, a week from now, somebody will be like, oh, this would be really cool. And like, we can sort of add those things later down the line too. But I think, that's a good starting point. So question 12. So these are not necessarily, there's going to be some number of people who will see this and be like, do we really need to? I would say yes, do what's best for your table. But question 12, safety tools. The 2 that I'm going to use for this session 0 are lines and veils, and the X card, basically, or stoplight method. So basically, lines and veils are things that you do not want in the game, or that you want basically shielded. So they're basically, if there's certain types of content that's very troubling for you, that brings you into bad places, like, we want this game to be fun. I don't want to be bringing up, difficult, emotions and things like that outside of the game. I don't want real pain. I want only game pain. And I don't want to, make people uncomfortable. Like, it's supposed to be fun. And I'm very happy to remove things that might otherwise be in there to avoid that. So basically, lines and veils is what we'll start with. A line is something that, bar none, not in the game, like, not even talked about. Like, it's just no. A veil is something that you're okay with it being in the game, but it's probably like fade to black or referenced off screen. Like we're not going to show it in graphic detail. So I'll go ahead and start to just try to break the ice on some of these. So a line for me is sexual violence. Just no, not at all. Like not even talked about. Just we can do plenty of dramatic stuff without getting into that. I don't want it. And I'll say an easy veil for me then is just one step below that of just sexual things. You know, if that's how it goes, we can kind of fade to black, but we don't need things on screen happening in that sphere. So that's two super easy ones for me in terms of hard stop and fade to black. So yeah, and an important note here that I'll say is you do not have to talk about why. You don't have to say like, I don't want this in the game because it will do this. Like you don't necessarily owe an explanation. If it's something that's going to make the game unfun for you, then it's okay just to leave it there. Of like, hey, this isn't in the game. And that's the end of the discussion. Now, if something that you would say is like an important feature of the game, then maybe it'll be important to talk about whether this is the game for you. Like if somebody came in here and said like, crime is a really tough one for me, I don't want to do things with crime, then like that's a pretty tough one to say like, okay, well, that's kind of what the game is about. Like, are you sure that this is the game for you? We would have that conversation. But, you know, generally speaking, you don't need an explanation. You don't need a reason or details. It's just like, hey, this isn't in the game, and that's okay. You can also use these for things that are not necessarily like trauma things, which is like, I don't want party conflict. Like I want, you know, I don't want party betrayal, you know, where like it's okay if the NPC stabs me in the back from 7 sessions from now, but I don't want it to be James that stabs me in the back. Like that would make it really unfun for me. So it's okay for lines to even be stuff like that too. So is there anything that either of you would like to add to the list? And extra caveat, if you'd like to do so anonymously, you can add it to the doc anonymously later, and that's okay.
I personally just wanted to jump in and say that this particular part of the session 0 is very important and is also the most sort of, I guess, nebulous in the way that you handle it. You know, there are systems out there for this, and you touched on this a little bit with the light system earlier, which is this is not the only time to get those out. So if there's not something you thought of, that doesn't mean that if it's in the game later, you can't say anything. And especially with new groups, that's an important thing where, and again, there are systems for that within the game and things like that, but specifically the idea that you don't have to try and list every single thing that you might not like to see in the game. The other thing is, very similarly to everything we've said so far, I know both of these other people. And so there are some things that are almost to some degree a given. Obviously, we're going to try and give those examples and stuff, but some things almost don't need to be said. You know what I mean? But it's not a bad idea to say them. For me, both of those, you know, those lines and veils sound good. There's not a ton that really jumps out at me, but something I'm not, you know, generally a big fan of is like harm to animals. You know what I mean? Similarly with like sexual violence, I'm like, I don't think that that's a tool that can be used to create enough drama that it's worth worrying about. You know what I mean? I'm like, and this is a good example of, it might be a little ridiculous that I'm happy to talk about slicing the, you know, big bad's throat, but I'm like, well, let's not hurt the dogs if that's okay. You know, I'm like, that's just a thing for me. And that's okay, you know, and it should be okay at the table.
So if I could ask, is that a line or a veil? Like if there's a particularly powerful scene where like a horse might get, like, cause thinking of like The Godfather or something, where that was like one of the most iconic scenes, or is that like, no way, like don't do it? Or is it
I haven't
off screen?
Yeah. I haven't worked with the line and veil system, so that's a very good question. I would say that's a veil, because I do think that the repercussions can be used to great effect, but the actual actions are what I'm like, no, I don't think there's any reason to focus on.
To narrate,
yes, very much a veil,
yeah, which
exactly.
It is a very important distinction.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So then I'll say that I'm great with all those, and then Jeff, you used a couple of yours are basically mine. Is typically what I do. One veil that I typically add into all the games that I play is that harm to children, because I'm a dad, and so that's just like, I don't know. But I do understand in a dark world, you also, if you choose to play in a world like Dragongrin, it's not okay. In my opinion, it's not okay to just whitewash everything every time. But I just don't like explicitly, like you're saying. So to me, that's a veil of like, I mean, the loss of a child is a huge thing, and I would never do that lightly. But in some cases, if it's mentioned that, oh, well, there's this tragedy and many lost their lives, including, the young and the old or whatever, that's a veil for me. But I wouldn't want the description of like, and then this is what happened to the slow kids who couldn't run away fast enough,
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say is, so in a real world example, I'm just giving you all, these are not for me. But if you're watching this video, someone who has been enlisted in the military might have an issue with certain things because of their time enlisted. Someone who's been in, another one. It doesn't have to be quite to the scale that we've described either. If you're petrified of spiders or snakes,
yeah,
totally worth saying, hey, I know this is probably not for everybody, but that's a line for me. Like, I don't want to fight a giant spider or clowns or any of that stuff. It's totally okay.
Yeah, what I've gotten a lot is like claustrophobia of like, even like just you describing my character stuck in a tight space would like put me off. So it's just like, yeah, it's totally okay. It doesn't have to be, world shaking, like deep rooted trauma. It could just be like, yeah, that's just not for me. That's not my thing. It's totally okay.
And then another one that I would consider a veil. That's not, I don't expect you to do this. I don't like playing in a game and then all of a sudden I realize that the entire plot is like a thinly veiled version of our world to put forth some political agenda or something. On any spectrum for any party or any belief, I'm like, it just feels less like a game and more like I'm in some big commercial or something. So like, I don't mind real world stuff if it makes sense in the game, but I don't like it to feel like I don't want to get cornered and an NPC tries to lead me to Jesus, like it's sort of like translated. So,
yeah, that's totally fair. And yeah, so I think, and again, this is something that some people will, be totally cool with anything and everything. Some people will be pretty particular. Just be accommodating as much as possible, and things like that. And again, that list will be available for us to add things to at any point. So if you forgot to say today that you hate spiders, and then suddenly 3 days from now you're like, oh, I should have said spiders, like just go into the doc and add it in. So the other part 2 of question 12 that I'll get into, my second safety tool that I like to use is the stoplight. Basically, so lines and veils are great at sort of establishing broad baselines that'll always be there. So like, no violence to children, like that's on the table at all times, but you can't always account for like what your mood will be in the moment and how much you'll be affected by certain things. So like I'll give an example, like for me, of like something for me that I don't feel the need to put as a line or a veil is like difficult mental health struggle stuff, like especially like dissociation or like trying to make people feel crazy, like stuff like that. Most of the time I'll be totally okay with that. But if I'm in a weird space, then that could be something that could put me off. So basically the stoplight is this. If a scene is difficult, or approaching difficult subject matter, our game side chat, so in the Zoom chat, it would be, for us, or however you want to do it. Either of you you don't have to type anything if you don't want to, but if you are totally cool with where the scene is going, you can type basically green light to say like, hey, I'm into this. This is cool. Let's keep going. Yellow light is like, this is getting a little dicey. We don't need to stop, but like, let's be a little careful with how we handle this. And red light is like, this is hitting me in a way that's not good. This needs to you need to find a way to get us out of this situation like now. Or I'm going to have to step away, or we're going to have to talk about it, So basically just as a blanket extra thing so even if you have lines and veils set up, if we're in the game, in the moment, and you thought you would be okay with something and it's hitting you weird, or you forgot to mention something and it came up by accident, it basically just a way to say, like, I'm cool with this, let's be careful, or like this, yeah, let's find a way to veer. It's just, that's a thing that'll be on the table basically in perpetuity for the game. Any questions or comments about that? Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, specifically for me, just something I found for people that are new to this is, for some reason, the idea of having a system like that in the game is divisive. Some people don't like having it. I've personally never needed to use that system, but I am also a large proponent of I'd rather have it and not need it. So it's the kind of thing where it's never come up for me. I haven't played that many games really, but it doesn't feel bad to have it in the background just in case. So I'm all for that sort of thing. I just wanted to bring up that for some reason people don't like the idea that you could decide what their game is going to do, but I don't know. I've just never been a part of a group like that. I just wanted to throw out there that, I don't know, I like having it even though I've never used it.
Yeah, so I actually can say real quick that I actually have seen this. I personally haven't needed it, but I've been in games where other people have needed it, and it made a huge difference. And it's, yeah, I'm with you in that. Like, some people kind of view it as like some sort of like censorship thing, or like you're saying that they can't, tell the story the way that they want to. Like, for me, that's just, I don't want to get too down that track in this video. This isn't the platform for that conversation. But for me, as a way to kind of, wrap up my own stance on it, at least, is like comfort in the terms of like, causing actual like lasting discomfort and like negative effect is always more important than like specific story details. And it's usually surprisingly easy to veer away. Just as a super quick example, there's a situation where a player was kind of getting borderline into something, in like the sexual realm of things. And they were able to basically just go in the chat and say, like, this is getting a little weird. Can we find a way to veer off? And then GM's just like, hey, the door opens, somebody's in there. Whatever was going to happen, is not going to happen. They get distracted and the scene changes, boom, done. So it's a pretty small incidental thing.
Sure. And I think something that's super important is that if I'll try to say it this way, this isn't all the time, it's not, but it's a good baseline, is that in most workplaces, what should and could you say? And there's this weird thing that when you sit down to play tabletop RPGs, it's like, we can do anything. And it's like, but should you do anything? And it's like, consider the same social norms as though you were with a mixed group of people, like in a workplace or in a public place, as the baseline. I think is probably a good thing. Don't think that just because you're in the comfort of your home or someone else's home, that all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, we can do anything. And it's like, well, pump the brakes. And again, if you wouldn't say it at work, depending on your place of work, or you wouldn't say it in a McDonald's, in front of a bunch of people, again, there are a lot of caveats with that because I don't know you, I don't know where you work, and I don't know what you're comfortable saying at in a fast food place of business. But yeah, I think that it's really important so that you don't ruin someone else's entire concept of what D&D is, where they're like, oh, wow, I felt really violated in a weird way, and I don't ever want to feel that again. And now they associate that feeling and that situation with, oh, this is how everyone does it. So that's just, anyway.
Yeah, and the important thing to note is that these lines and veils and stoplight things are going to vary by the table. So if your table is down for whatever full, raunchy, crazy, bizarre, as long as everybody is okay with that, then the game can be that. But it's just important to have that discussion ahead of time of like, this could get weird. Is everybody down to get weird? And maybe the answer is yes. By all means, I go for it. But yeah, that this isn't cutting out any content like at a automatic level. It's just offering players the chance to have the discussion, which I think is the important part. So yeah, we don't need to get too far into like the specifics. And there are lots of other safety tools other than lines and veils and stoplight that you can use. We won't spend a lot of time going through all those here. But yeah, just it's an important question either way. But I think I'm good to move on from that if you guys are.
Sure, that'd be great.
So we're getting to the home stretch here. So rules, just as a very base level. So what system will be playing in, and will there be third-party homebrew rules? So 5e, and in terms of third-party rules, we'll be using Dead Man's Guide to Dragon Grin, heritages and cultures and subsystems, and kind of the variant rules there within. I'm open to additional materials, like if you had an archetype from a third-party publisher that you thought was really cool, stuff like that. I'm open for. If it's not like direct Wizards material, I'd appreciate just a quick heads up of like, hey, I found this archetype in this book. Is this okay? But as a baseline, that's kind of the system structure that I was going in with. If you guys are cool with that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sounds
that's
awesome.
perfect.
I was just going to mention real quick to those of you watching very quickly. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of homebrew things available online. And so I would say just be very careful. I am exceptionally restrictive in terms of people bringing like brand new classes or brand new races that I've never seen and all that. So there are so many published options that in many cases what you're looking to do is done, and in a play tested format that has been fully approved and vetted, and that's my recommendation. So I'm not saying don't, but I'm saying try tested, printed, published material first before you go to a wiki and pull some or D&D Beyond and pull some crazy archetype. That just puts the group in a bad position because now the game master is having to juggle that extra thing. So I want to mention that there's plenty of stuff out there that even looks like it's formatted like D&D because of many of the online tools. Just pass everything by your game master first. And so I thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess back in terms of answering this specifically for our session 0, a couple of just very baseline homebrew things that I like to do. The biggest one is critical hits. The way that I do critical hits is basically you roll your damage die like normal, and then whatever your damage die is, you add that max value as well. So if you roll a d10 and you get a 5 on the d10, then you'd also add 10, so it'd be 15 damage plus your modifier. Instead of rolling 2 dice, I do 1 max, 1 roll, basically, just as a thing to be ready for. I do also like to do critical hit charts in terms of like, if you roll a crit, maybe you can cut their finger off or knock their weapon out of their hand or cause them some sort of lasting injury that matters. It can get pretty violent and it can get pretty deadly mechanically. So I'm open to dialing that back, but that's kind of it. I think it'd be cool, especially with the sort of crime theme. I think it kind of lends itself to that sort of just that tiny bit too much levels of violence sometimes. So if you guys are both open to it, both narratively having it be violent and mechanically having crits potentially be impactful, if not outright deadly, is that something that would put you guys off the game to have been?
No, I think that sounds great. Yeah.
Awesome.
I also like the way you phrased that question. Not is that something you'd like, but is that something you wouldn't like? Which is just a little distinction, but no, I think I'm definitely down with that.
Sounds fun.
All right. Question 14. Just last couple here. How much focus are we going to be putting into mechanics being strict and rules as written versus like story first, rule of cool, moment to moment calls? So I'm kind of split on this one. For me as a GM, I like playing the game. So like, playing out combats, using the rules, I like having those things as part of the experience, but I also don't want to be bound to them where, if a specific moment it's like killing it, then obviously I'm down to look at potentially making other sorts of calls, or like just doing things narratively and skipping mechanics, where it matters. But I think for me as a baseline, I like the game, I like the rules, and I want to see them more or less faithfully upheld with the asterisk that, I'm open if somebody wants to try something crazy, or if things kind of get into a weird place, that there's the option to look at other ways. But I'm open if that would be too much or too little.
I'd say I'm very much the same way, in the sense that basically in most cases, I can expect that the rules will be followed, but that in general, first of all, I trust you to make those calls, but especially that, yes, that I think that there are always cases that a game can get into that you need to fudge something or shift something a little bit, and I'm totally okay with that. I guess the only thing I would say is, as long as it's a discussion at the very least, rather than just a definite, this is how we're doing it. Even, saying that you have the last call, but to at least be able to defend why you've decided to make that. But otherwise, I'm like, no, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, and I think that for me, I'm with you guys. I would say that for anyone watching, unless you have a command of the rules, I think you should try to stick with rules as written so that you know which ones to change and why. Like, Jeff has a very solid understanding of not basing life or death on one roll, when failure is fun, when people should roll for things outside of maybe what's written. So if you're going to sort of spitball that and do it on the fly, it's very easy to accidentally hamstring a player or part of the game. Having said that, I'm with you guys, whereas my sort of baseline is the spirit of the rule. Like, the rules are usually there to limit people who abuse them in many cases, or set limitations so that expectations are relative. But like, if it's narratively awesome, for me to be able to jump and hit the switch, but I'm literally 5 feet away from it, as a player, I would like the liberty to be able to go, hey, if I do that, can I take damage for, like, at a cost? So like, I'm all about that sort of gamble and pushing things that would actually tax me. Not like, well, hey, can you make it so we win? But narratively, this makes the most sense that I push this button because that's the story beat, But also understanding that sometimes life goes, no country for old men, things don't make sense. And the role is like, oh, you miss it, you don't push the button. And the story now is about the aftermath of, so I'm down with vibing it. But yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I guess in terms of rules, one important thing is that we'll be playing theater of the mind. So specifically rules with distance and like area of effect and things like that might be a little bit more hazy and flowy than it would be if we had a battle grid, So like you say, if sometimes it's like the switch is 32 feet away, so if you were playing rules as written, you wouldn't be able to get to it. But because we're kind of in this theater of the mind wash space, then stuff like that will be a little bit more flexible, for good and for bad, in the sense that, if you have a spell that's like, I shoot, a grid of this way, things like that might be a little bit harder to determine, but that will just work together to make it happen. But those rules specifically might be a little bit different by nature of not having a grid and stuff like that. Alrighty. So the next category of questions, schedule stuff. So question 15, when will this game be played? How frequently? And what times will the games be at? This one doesn't really make sense for us to answer here, because this is just kind of an example thing. Like, this isn't going to be a live play that we're doing like on the channel or anything like that, at least at this stage of things. But, knowing that you're going to play on Saturday at 2 or, every other Monday at 5:30, just kind of at a baseline. And maybe the answer to this question is we play when we can and we'll figure it out. That's okay. I'm not saying that you have to like create a strict, rigid, unbreaking schedule here, but it is at least important to talk about. So if somebody's expecting it to be at a certain day or, every week, and other people are like, every week? I thought this was going to be once a month. Like, I can't do every week, and Saturday doesn't work for me. Like, this is the time to like find the days and times and frequencies that'll work for the table.
Yeah, I think there's a wide spectrum of stuff that can fall under this. So like you said, that expectation of how often to play for me is a big one, as well as talking about whether you expect to play on the same day or like the same every other Wednesday, because personally for me, things like that tend not to work. It's difficult just the way my schedule is with work and other things. So it's just good to be on the same page about what people's schedules kind of look like, so that you do all this work and then you can't schedule the first session because there's not a single day that works for everybody.
Yeah, I think that this is probably the most challenging thing for any D&D table. Most is that it's just people are very busy, you know, and even people who aren't very busy usually play with people who are, and then it becomes challenging. So be flexible and set expectations early. So like for me, what I would say is my Friday and Saturday in many cases is the one sort of like Friday night, and then Saturday is what I block off to spend devoted, dedicated 100% time with my wife and daughter and the rest of my family, which is very challenging because in many cases that is exactly when people want to play D&D. So I'm flexible in that if that's really the only time people can do, I make expectations and manage my wife's expectations and make an exception and say, hey, on this particular, but I try not to do it more than maybe once a month. You know, so you also have to make the decision of whether or not you're going to play if everyone's there and the kind of campaign.
That's the next question, actually.
Okay, gotcha. See,
yeah.
So, all right, so I jumped ahead, but so then I'll say that if it was me and if it was real, I would say, hey, my preference would be like Wednesday nights for about 3 hours, 4 hours. I would be super down. I'll block that off. Any one Wednesday, I'm down. It can even be back to back if it's month to month. That I'll make that commitment.
And I don't know if this is on. Is session length on the questions?
I
think so, right?
I didn't add it, but that should be part of this one too. I'll actually add it in right now.
So yeah, because Tim mentioning that made me realize that, and I've never really talked about that in a session 0, actually, to be clear to everyone. But that's one thing that's very important is sometimes you get in a game and you don't talk about it and suddenly you're playing for 5 hours and you didn't expect that. That's another good thing. Yeah.
6, and you have Eastern and people are on Pacific and it's like, it's only 7 o'clock. I'm like, it's not 7. It's 10 o'clock here.
Yeah.
I gotta be up at 6.
And especially home groups where that time can suddenly start to vary much. Like online, it's a little bit more regimented in terms of like 3 to 4 hour sessions. Like it's a pretty hard limit. Like very rarely will it go past that. But some home groups, they're like, you know, I've known groups who will be like, all right, we get together at 8 a.m. and at 10 p.m, we're still kicking. And it's like, you know, you need to be ready if that's going to be the case, that's kind of what you're getting yourself into. Is there's a huge difference. Like for me personally, I start to top out at like, I'm extremely happy, fully focused for about 3 hours. I can push that 4th hour if I need to and make it work. Once I start to get past that, I really start to fray at the edges of my ability to like be on guard and to play as well as I want to and to like focus on the game. So having that conversation of like, we like to play 8 hours. Can you sit down for 8 hours and play? You know, that might be doable for some people. If by all means, like have at it. Like for me, that I can't do that. Having a moment to set that standard too is an important one. So I added that to the doc as an extra part of that question. Yeah. When will sessions happen? How frequently and how long will the sessions go?
On average. Like, because I get it. Things go late.
Yeah.
Or, hey, do you guys want to finish this fight? You know, but yeah.
Yeah,
it's good as a benchmark.
All right. Last main question here, also about schedule. So what's going to be standard procedure if somebody is not able to make the game? Will the game continue without them or be postponed until they can join? How will it be handled in game if you're going to play anyways and they're not going to be there to play their character? How will that work? So for this specifically, I don't think it makes sense to play without everybody here, considering there's 2 players. So it's a little bit different as if you have like a 7-person table and you can easily play with 6 instead of 7, you know, or 4 instead of 5. But yeah, it's still an important conversation to have. Is the expectation going to be like, hey, no, every other Wednesday, this game is happening. If I have to run it by myself, like I'm doing, like this is happening, you know, and some tables, that's the way that people like to do it. So that because it is a big time commitment to say like, hey, I'm planning 3 to 4 hours of my life on Wednesday night to be there. So if, I'm going to make that commitment and say that that's what my day is blocked out for, like, I want some reasonable expectation that I'm going to get to play some D&D, on that night, which is fair to say, So if somebody can't make it, some groups like to just soldier on and say like, hey, we've made the commitment, we have the time, we're going to play. Where some groups, it's very like story and very character driven. It's like, hey, we just can't play the game without everybody here. We need that. So it's an important line to draw, and there's no wrong answers except for the ones that don't work for your table and your style. So yeah, with this specific game, I think that if somebody was not able to play, that we would just skip and find the next available time that works. But again, I'm open to conversations.
Yeah, and to give an example, because I completely agree with that. I don't think it would make sense. But to give an example of something that I've seen is to at least be open to playing without a player. Because there's a campaign somebody I know is in, and they're getting close to the end of the arc, so they're skipping when somebody can't do it. Whereas prior, they would have just soldiered on, but it's like everything's kind of wrapping up, so they want to definitely finish it. Things like that, where you can still be open. Again, this isn't setting the hard line, but just again setting expectations.
Yeah, and if you know that you're going to be playing with people who are very busy, it's sometimes okay. No, it's sometimes encouraged to just take self-inventory and say, hey, listen, there's going to probably be like, I'm a 50-50. Make it so that their character is called away, or as Jeff, you say, like, figure out ways in game to handle it. Like, if we were playing with 5 people, I would say I would build in from the beginning of the campaign that I have to go and do this Zarfin audit every so often, or I have to check in on my Archons, or have this narrative thing built in. Like, it's good if you're a cleric, you could say you have to go and do service at your temple, or whatever the hand wave sort of understood thing is. It's like, oh, cool. Hey, this week I'm going to be doing my Archon thing. It's not an excuse to miss. And if you miss too many sessions, it's a different discussion, but that makes it really easy so that the game master can just go, okay, boom. And the player's like, oh, cool. Yeah. Tim's off doing his Archon thing. And then it's also a cool opportunity, because one of those times it could be an interesting thing to actually play out later down the line if everyone has to come with me, or it's like, hey, can you guys come with me? There's someone trying to cause trouble. And now you're like, oh, this is where he goes all the time. This is interesting. So anyway, hand wavy, build in an idea of a reason why if your character is not going to be there often.
Yeah, and there are plenty of other ways too that people like have handled that sort of thing of like sometimes just like NPCing the character of like, he's there with you. Like, we're not gonna like, have him be attacked and killed like in the battle, but they're there, they're helping in the way. We're not gonna. And I've seen, and sometimes I actually even prefer this method of just straight up not acknowledging it. They're just like,
yep,
they're just vaporized from existence for that session, and you can reference them, but you just don't even try to like find justifications. Just like, he's not here. Like, maybe he's here, narratively in the sense that technically they're there, but we're not going to acknowledge anything that he does or says or anything that happens. He's just also here, also contributing in an invisible, unseen way. Like, so just whatever works for the table. I'd recommend against generally, unless the table's really into it specifically, like to not make decisions for that character while that player is gone. So like, I wouldn't ever like have a, like, you're not here to say your character, so I'm going to say that he does this risky thing and then he fails the role. It's just, on average, that's a pretty bad look unless the table's into that sort of chaos. But yeah, just whatever way works to, write them out for the day, if that is the way that you're going to go, and just play on without them.
Yeah, and quick note, if you think it's preposterous to have them there but not there, I want you to think of all of the drama TV shows that you watch. Where are those babies now? When it's important to the story for the child or the baby to be there, oh, they have a baby and the baby's in the scene, and oh, there's the baby and the baby's walking. 4 episodes. Where's that baby? Who's taking care of that baby? But it's because that's not the point at that moment. So just have the drama baby and just whoop, they fade into the background. Or that favorite character of yours who's just like, Count, they haven't been in an episode for 2 episodes, but it's just assumed that they're alive and doing the normal things that they would do, and then they're back and it's normal. So.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. So the last kind of catch-all question here, question 17. Is there anything else about this game, either in-world stuff of like the things about the world, about the characters, or out-of-game stuff about concepts or rules, or just any other things that you guys feel you would need to address or talk about? Anything that maybe has fallen through the gaps or kind of loose threads that you'd like to see tied up in any way?
No, I think having done this, a couple of times, I think we covered a lot. I think that's the big thing, is this is a good time to cover stuff that you need everybody for. But there's also that next step of, oh, but Jeff, I'll talk to you later about this specific thing I want to work in with my character that isn't pertinent to everyone. So we're not going to use the time to do that.
Yeah. And I echo that. I think this is super inclusive in terms of, I feel really good about my expectations. So yeah, I'm good.
Cool. So that'll be the end of the question specifically. So yeah, that's basically a session 0. So we have basically everything we need at this point to start playing the game. We know where we're going to be playing. We know the characters. We kind of know the feel that we want the game to have. We have our limits and ways to handle those. So basically, if any of these things come up in the game that people start to have issues with, we can always kind of point back now at this point. If somebody's like, hey, what's with all this crime? Like, stuff, like we can just easily say like, oh, well, we talked about this. It's just a great way to sort of guard all those things so that, if somebody tries to, if Tim tries to betray James in cold blood, and we made that a line, then we can, as a GM, I would feel comfortable then saying like, actually, Tim, I'm going to not allow you to do that. Like, you can't do that. Like, I don't care if in the rules you're allowed to. I'm going to say I'm vetoing because we talked about this. We said that's not on the table. And I'm going to uphold that. It kind of gives you the as a GM, if you need to play hardball with that sort of thing, you can. Yeah. And it gives me a ton of great things to work with of like, I have all these amazing inspired ideas of all the things that I know will make them excited to play. And it really can be a great hype builder for the game too, of like, not only have we crossed all these things that are off limits, we have this entire list of all these things that everyone's super stoked for. And it can really build a lot of great momentum going into session 1 of like, all those awesome things we talked about, here they come. Like, we're ready to go.
And it hits me, and I think we'll close with this, unless, James, you have anything else you want to add. It hits me that I think that the reason why most people start a D&D game in a tavern is because they don't do a session 0. And there's nothing wrong with that, and sometimes it's the best way to do it. But this is us starting in a tavern. Now Jeff can put us in the middle of an entire situation, and we have a full shared context. And that if he starts throwing things at us, we'll be like, oh yeah, this is what we talked about. So yeah, I think that that's kind of a cool thing to think about. It's the game can begin immediately. There's no like ramp up exploratory. Where do you want to go? I don't know. What do you want to do? Oh, you want to go Red Wizards and Dragons and you want to go be a crime boss. So yeah, I think this was super fun. I am excited to use this hypothetical campaign for other things we talk about and do on the channel in the future now that people have that frame of reference. So is there anything else you wanted to throw in there, James?
No, I think that was really good. And this is actually, I would say this is the most thorough session 0 I've done. And I love the idea of having the questions and whether you use ours or not, prior to the session 0, agreeing on the questions you want to go through. I think we could have cut half of those because of our shared context. And that idea where you can even go back as far as that. So that's the only thing I'd say. This is not a functional thing that you have to follow. Even if you just go, what game are we going to play? Where are we going to do it? That's okay. This is just like about the maximum that you could do, and you can tailor it however you need or want to.
Yeah, that's a good point of like the questions, the way that I basically put them up is to like cover as much as possible. If you don't need all this, you can very easily pare down. But basically, if you've never done this before at all, and the session 0 is a new concept that you're going to be trying out, I'd recommend a more thorough approach just to kind of see how it feels. But once you kind of get used to like the group that you're playing with and what everybody likes, then it's, it's very easy to start to crunch it down and just say like, okay, we're playing in the same world as last time. So the stuff about the setting and the pillars, we don't need to talk about that because it's the same as it was when we played the other game. And I know that you're narrative people, so I'll skip the thing about the rules and, how we're going to fudge and things like that. You can kind of learn where you can start to skip over and shorten and lengthen. But as a starting point, hopefully it's useful as a guide. If you're coming in like, what's a session 0? What do we do? Hopefully this was a good guide as to what it might look like to cover a lot of those bases.
Awesome. Well, if this was something that you enjoyed, please consider hitting the like button. Comment below on anything you have questions about, anything you have a specific comment in terms of your experience with, whether it's worked or didn't work. And if you've done session 0s, if you haven't, basically, what's your experience with the session 0 and any questions? So we are Tabletop Terrors. We're all about fun, creativity, and tabletop RPGs. And so if you like those things, you can consider subscribing to the channel and be sure to hit the notification bell so you know when our videos are going to come out. Let's wrap up this session 0 with a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
Cilantro. I got an out of Jeff. I don't know if I've ever got an out of Jeff. That's great. So I wanted to.
There was the one time where I did a horribly exaggerated one as a joke to make fun of it. But other than that.
And this was different how? No. It was a less horribly exaggerated one to make fun of it. Duh. Yes.